Three ships, 37 warships, and the man responsible for stopping them hasn't slept yet. He's been standing at a viewport, pressing his palm to cold glass, counting colony lights because counting is the only thing that is keeping him from thinking about what's coming. This is not a story about superior weapons or superior numbers. It's about what happens when a species that grew up with no rules meets an enemy that built a civilization on them. Let's go.
The alarm did not wake Admiral Elias Rook because he had not been asleep. He had been standing at the viewport for 3 hours, left palm flat against the cold glass, watching the colony lights of Hesper 4 arrange themselves in the dark below, like someone had spilled a jar of fireflies and forgotten to clean them up. He had been counting them, absently, the way a man counts ceiling tiles in a room where he is trying not to think. He had gotten to 400 and something and lost count twice and started over both times. The glass was so cold his hand ached. He did not move it. The alarm meant the picket drones had found something, which meant the something he had been not thinking about for 3 hours had arrived. He crossed the bridge of the Ardent with the specific walk of a man who had trained himself, over 22 years, to move in a way that told the people around him nothing was wrong even when everything was wrong. His boots were loud on the deck, plating in the way boots are loud when a ship has been running silent for too long, and all the small noises have been eaten by tension. The air recyclers hummed. Somewhere in the walls, a relay that needed replacing ticked once per second like a very slow clock. Commander Zara Vance was already at the tactical display when he arrived, her dark hair tied back in the blunt, practical way she wore it when she expected a long night. She had circles under her eyes that she had not had 6 months ago. She did not turn around. 37 contacts, she said. En route from the Yeldrin transit point. Tethani configuration. Fleet formation, not survey posture. Rook looked at the display. 37 points of light in perfect geometric order, spread across 200,000 kilometers of approach vector, each one exactly where doctrine said it would be. The Tethani did everything by doctrine. That was the thing about them. They were very, very good at following the rules they had written for themselves. Arrival estimate. 6 hours and change, if they hold current velocity. She paused. They will hold current velocity. They always hold current velocity. Rook studied the formation. 37 ships. The Ardent, the Meridian, and the converted cargo hauler they had been calling the problem since she'd lost her name plaque in a docking collision 3 weeks ago. 3 ships. He did some arithmetic in his head that he did not share out loud. "Give me Cade," he said. Dr. Mira Cade arrived on the bridge smelling like machine oil and the particular chemical sharpness of solder, which meant she had been in the engineering bay doing something that was either going to save them all or that he had specifically told her not to do. Both of these things were often the same thing. She was 41, with the wiry, slightly frantic energy of someone who slept in 4-hour bursts and was at her sharpest at 2 in the morning, which was when most of the catastrophic decisions that had kept them alive this long had been made. "The array?" he asked. "Not yet." She tucked something into the pocket of her jacket. He did not ask what it was. "But if they park in standard accord-compliant engagement distance, I can have it ready before they fire the first salvo." He turned back to the display. Standard accord-compliant engagement distance. The Tethani would hold their fleet at precisely the distance the Accords of War specified. They would send a formal declaration encoded in the standard diplomatic frequency. They would then wait the specified 6.4 hours before initiating combat. They would target only military assets. They would break off if surrender was offered. They had been doing this exact thing for 800 years across 416 recorded conflicts in galactic history, and they had never lost a war fought this way, not once, and they had never seen any reason to do it differently. Rook thought about the colony lights below. 400 and something. He thought about a girl whose lowercase R looked like a tiny wave. "Wake the crew," he said. They had not come to Hesper 4 by accident, any of them. The planet was a mid-tier agricultural colony, 11,000 people, established 40 years ago by the first wave of human expansion beyond the Kepler belt. It grew a strain of modified soybean that produced a protein compound the Tethani pharmaceutical market paid well for. And 3 years ago, the Tethani Ascending Council had decided that they would prefer to own that supply chain rather than purchase it. This was the kind of decision that was made in boardrooms on the Tethani home world, in the comfortable air-conditioned offices of beings who had never actually stood on any of the worlds they were deciding about, by beings for whom war was a formality, a legal instrument, a way of settling property disputes that had graduated beyond the courts. They had filed the declaration through proper channels. They had waited for the response. They had received, from the ad hoc human diplomatic mission in the Yeldrin system, a document that Executor Draxel Kor had read 3 times because he was certain he was misunderstanding it. The document said, "We do not recognize the authority of the Accords of War over human citizens or human territory. We do not recognize the concept of a declared military engagement as distinct from any other form of violence. If you send your fleet to Hesper 4, we will defend it. We will not follow your rules. We will not stop until one side stops existing. Sincerely, the Human Expeditionary Authority." Kor had taken the document to Strategos Velkirin Thul, who commanded the fleet, and Thul had read it once and set it down. "They are new," he said, which was the Tethani way of saying they don't know any better. "They will learn." Thul was old by Tethani standards, which meant he had fought in 11 formal engagements and won all 11. He was the kind of being who had become calm across a very long life. Not because calm came naturally to him, but because he had arrived at the conclusion, through experience, that panic was never useful and clarity was always available if you chose it. He stood 6 feet tall with the narrow-shouldered, elongated frame of his species, and his 4 eyes were each the color of winter water, and he moved on his bridge with the unhurried certainty of someone who had seen everything that could happen in a battle and made his peace with the range of outcomes. He understood that humans were biologically different from every species currently party to the Accords. He understood that they were young. He understood that their internal political structures were fragmented in ways that had seemed, to every external observer, to be a terminal weakness. He understood that their technology was modest, their ships slower than anything in his fleet by a significant margin, their weapons systems outdated, their numbers at Hesper 4 3 vessels against his 37. He did not fully understand what was in the document that Kor had handed him, but he understood that it did not matter. They would engage at legal range. They would target military assets only. They would offer surrender terms when the human ships were disabled. The humans would take the terms, as all species eventually did, because the alternative to surrender in the Accords was destruction, and no species with any rational capacity would choose destruction when the only thing at stake was a soybean processing colony in an outer system. He looked at his fleet on the display. 37 ships in perfect formation. He thought of the word new again, with something that was almost tenderness. He was going to teach them. That was all. Sergeant Noah Kane was in the forward bay of the Ardent eating a protein bar that tasted like chalk, and Vanilla had gotten into a fight, and Chalk had won when the intercom opened and Rook's voice came through. And the voice was the particular kind of quiet that Kane had learned, in 4 years of serving under Rook, to be more afraid of than shouting. The briefing was short. 37 Tethani ships. 6 hours. 3 human vessels. Kane listened to the numbers and ate the rest of the protein bar and threw the wrapper in the direction of a recycling bin and missed, and did not pick it up. Across the bay, Corporal Yi was cleaning her rifle with the focused, meditative efficiency of someone who had been cleaning rifles since she was 17. She was 23 now. She had the kind of face that looked younger than it was in still moments and older than it was in motion. She hummed while she cleaned, a low, tuneless sound that she was not aware she made. Private Desmond Adara was writing something on a tablet with the old-fashioned physical stylus he kept in his breast pocket, because he had learned early in his service that the stylus worked without power and without network connection and in atmospheres where digital interfaces became unreliable, which described most of the environments he had been in when he needed to write things down. He was composing a letter that he wrote to his mother every engagement and never sent until the engagement was over. He had not sent her one yet. He had written 11. Kane looked at both of them and felt the specific thing you feel when you realize that the people around you have already become real to you in the way that makes what is coming worse. "We're going to do something the Tethani have never seen," Kane said. You looked up. "Are we going to win?" "I have no idea." He paused. "But it's going to be interesting." She went back to cleaning the rifle. Dr. Cade's array was not a weapon, technically. It was a signal architecture, a distributed processing network she had built across 17 repurposed satellite bodies in the outer orbital band of Hesper 4, each one running a fragment of a decision-making system she had been developing for 4 years, which the Galactic Accords of War specifically prohibited under Article 17, Section 4, which described AI-assisted weapons systems as a violation of the principle of meaningful human control over lethal decisions. Kate had several responses to Article 17, Section 4, the politest of which was that she did not think it applied to her because the system was not a weapon. It was a brain that happened to be attached to weapons. The system did not have a name yet. She had been trying to name it for 2 years, and nothing had stuck. She had gone through 17 possibilities, which was why it was currently running on 17 satellite bodies. This was either a coincidence or the universe trying to tell her something. What it could do, if everything worked the way she hoped, was the following. It could watch an incoming fleet, model every ship's movement based on observed thrust signatures, communications timing, and formation geometry, and tell the 3 human ships where to be, 2 minutes before the Tethani ships got there, with a margin of error that was smaller than the humans could achieve through any other method. It could do this faster than any human crew could process the information. It could do this for 37 ships simultaneously. She had tested it against simulations. She had never tested it against an actual fleet. She went to tell Rook this, found him on the bridge, and told him. He looked at the display for a moment. "Does it work?" he said. "In simulation, yes. In reality, I don't." "Does it work?" She thought about 17 satellite bodies and 4 years of work. "Yes," she said. He nodded and went back to looking at the display, and she went back to the engineering bay, and neither of them mentioned that the margin of their survival had just gotten significantly smaller than it already was. The Tethani fleet arrived on schedule. They held at the Accord-mandated engagement distance, 12,000 kilometers, which was calculated to allow a clear line of fire while reducing the risk of collateral orbital damage to inhabited bodies. They sent the formal declaration on the diplomatic frequency. They waited. On the bridge of his flagship, the Certainty of Form, Strategos Thull reviewed the tactical disposition of the human vessels. The Ardent, the Meridian, and an unnamed cargo hauler that had been modified in ways his sensors were not quite making sense of. They were holding in a triangular formation 2,000 kilometers above Hesper IV's equatorial band, which was a defensible enough position for 3 ships and would not matter in any meaningful way. "Their response?" he asked. "None yet, Strategos." He waited. The 6.4 hours passed. He gave the order to begin.
Before we go any further, here is the full picture. Strategos Thul, 11 wars, 0 losses, 37 warships, and the quiet confidence of someone who considers this engagement a formality. Admiral Rook, 3 ships, a damaged cargo hauler everyone calls the problem, and a scientist named Caddy who spent 4 years building a banned AI brain hidden inside the civilian satellites. Thul's fleet won't target because the rules say so. The humans built their most dangerous weapons inside the rules blind spot. Thul just fired for the first time in 800 years of civilized conflict. The enemy isn't playing the same game.
The first salvo from the Tethani fleet was precision-targeted, as all their salvos were, aimed at the Ardent's drive systems, the Meridian's weapons array, the cargo hauler's communications hub. The intent was to disable, not destroy. The Accords preferred disabled ships to destroyed ones. Disabled ships surrendered. Destroyed ships created diplomatic complications. 1,200 kilometers away, the Ardent was not where the salvo was aimed. This was not, in itself, remarkable. Ships moved. Tactical maneuvering was expected. But the Ardent's movement had begun 3 seconds before the firing solution was transmitted from the Tethani lead ship to its fleet, and that transmission was encrypted and quantum-keyed, and there was no way a human crew should have known it was coming. Thull looked at the display. The second salvo was adjusted. The Ardent moved again, 3 seconds before the targeting data was transmitted. On the tactical display, the Meridian was repositioning as well, in a direction that should have put it into the path of the 4th salvo, but instead placed it exactly between 2 Tethani ships in a firing geometry that the ships had not yet calculated and would not calculate for another 4 seconds. The Meridian fired. Thull watched the display update. One of his ships had taken a hit to its lateral array. Not catastrophic, not even particularly damaging, but the hit had come from a position that had required knowing where his ship was going to be, not where it was. "They are reading our targeting transmissions," said his tactical officer. "Impossible," Thull said, because it was. There was a silence on the bridge. The display updated again. Something small and cold moved through him, slow as a tide. The first 40 minutes were the worst. The Ardent took 3 hits in that window, 2 of them glancing. One of them solid enough to buckle the secondary hull plating above the engineering bay and send a sound through the ship, like someone had struck a bell the size of a building. The lights on the bridge went to emergency amber and held. The air circulation system changed character in a way that Rook felt in his sinuses. Thinner, slightly metallic, the specific quality of air that has been through the emergency processors rather than the primary ones. They lost the Meridian's forward railgun array in the 14th minute. They lost it slowly, which was the worst way to lose a weapons system. Not an explosion but a degradation, shot after shot degrading the coils until Lieutenant Okafor, who ran the Meridian's weapons from a console that had started giving him static across his right side displays, reported the malfunction in the flat voice of someone who had been expecting this and had decided not to feel it yet. Switch to secondaries, Vance told him, over the intership link. Already there, Commander. How are you on secondaries? A pause. I can work with it. She turned from the display to Rook and said nothing, which was how they communicated in the worst moments, with silence that carried exactly the information that words would only blunt. Private Desmond Adara was in a damage control crew in the forward compartment when the hull buckle happened, and he heard the bell sound travel through the deck, plating into his boots, and up through his legs, and into his teeth. He tasted copper. He was 30 seconds into bracing a fractured conduit brace with a manual torque wrench, the muscles of his forearms burning with the specific deep ache of sustained effort, when the emergency amber came on and the compartment smelled briefly of hot polymer and ozone. He finished the brace. He moved to the next one. Yi was in the aft gun bay, feeding ammunition cassettes into a secondary kinetic driver that was technically rated for point defense, but that they had reconfigured, with Cade's modifications, to fire in longer bursts at the approach angles the array was flagging. She was feeding the 4th cassette when the ship shook hard enough to knock her shoulder into the housing. She finished feeding the cassette. Her shoulder hurt. She filed this information in the part of her mind that dealt with things that were not the immediate problem. In the engineering bay, Cade watched the array status across 17 satellite bodies and saw 2 of them go dark in the 11th minute, hit by debris from a Tethani precision shot that had not been aimed at the satellites. The Tethani did not know they were there, which was the point, but had passed close enough to destroy them anyway. She rerouted. The system recalculated with 15 nodes instead of 17. Still good? Rook asked over the link. Still functional, she said, which was a different thing, but he did not push it. In the 40th minute, the unnamed cargo hauler that everyone called the problem made its first independent move. The problem had been modified to do something that no ship in the Tethani fleet had a doctrine entry for. It had been loaded with ejection pods that contained, instead of crew, a mixture of metallicized debris and high-yield explosive charges triggered by proximity fuses. The crew of the problem, 12 people, the smallest crew of any of the 3 vessels, all volunteers, had programmed these pods to deploy in a spreading pattern that looked, on Tethani sensors, like a debris field from a destroyed ship. They deployed the pods and then flew directly toward the Tethani formation. It was Corporal Yi who named the maneuver later, in the way soldiers name things, flatly, without ceremony, stripping it down to its essential quality. She called it the fakery, which was not a tactical term, but was accurate. The Tethani fleet adjusted formation to avoid the apparent debris field. 3 ships from the left flank repositioned, creating a gap in their coverage of the Ardent's approach vector. The Ardent went through the gap. On the bridge of the certainty of form, Strategos Thull watched his tactical display with an expression that his officers had never seen on him before, not in 11 wars, not in 416 years of recorded Tethani conflict, and could not quite identify, because it was not anger, and it was not panic, and it was not the cold recalibration of tactical disappointment. It was something more fundamental, the sensation of a hand reaching for something that had always been in a specific place and finding only air. The cargo ship is not withdrawing, his tactical officer said. I can see that. It should be withdrawing. It has deployed its emergency countermeasures. Under the Accords, a ship that has exhausted its combat utility. I know what the Accords say. The problem was flying straight at his fleet. Not the defensive line. The fleet itself. He watched the human ship come in, small and battered and moving with a kind of absolute purposefulness that his tactical models had no category for, and he felt, for the first time in this engagement, a faint wrongness that he could not immediately locate. Not fear, not concern, something more preliminary than either. The sensation of a fact that did not fit with the other facts, sitting just outside the range of immediate identification, like a word in a foreign language that he had heard before but could not quite place. The problem had 12 crew. He knew this. His intelligence on the human vessels was incomplete in its specifics, but the cargo hauler class was well documented, and the modifications it had undergone had been visible on his sensors since the early phase of the engagement. 12 crew. They had deployed their emergency countermeasures, the ejection pods, now floating as a debris field between the fleets, each one leaving a contrail of metallicized chaff that was still slowly spreading through the engagement zone. They had no further weapons. Their hull integrity was compromised at 3 points that his sensors had flagged. Their drive was running hot and had been running hot since the engagement began, which meant the safety governors had been disabled, which meant the crew had decided to burn the drive rather than preserve it. This was not rational behavior. A ship with no weapons and compromised hull integrity did not fly toward a fleet of 37 warships. It withdrew. It offered surrender. It did the thing that the Accords specified and that every rational calculation supported. The problem did not withdraw. He made a decision that violated Section 14 of his operational doctrine, which specified that a retreating or unarmed vessel should not be engaged with primary weapons systems, because the sight of it coming toward him felt, at a level he could not articulate to his officers, like the edge of something he did not want to see the bottom of. He fired. The problem died 3,000 kilometers from the nearest Tethani ship. The proximity fuses on 6 ejection pods cooked off in the explosion. The debris cloud that resulted was real this time. 2 Tethani ships took minor hull damage. On the Ardent, Rook was informed. He held the news for 3 seconds, which was the time he gave himself, always, for this part. Then he went back to the display, because the display was the only thing left. In the hours between the problem's death and the second major engagement, the battle paused the way real battles do. Not cleanly, not completely, but in the way a thing that has been in motion slows to a coast, bleeding momentum before the next push. The Tethani fleet was recalibrating. The Ardent and the Meridian were reloading, patching, breathing. Rook found Kane in a corridor on the lower deck, sitting on the floor with his back against the bulkhead, eating something from a foil pack that might have been stew if you were generous in your definitions. The corridor smelled like burned insulation and recycled air and the faint mineral smell of the hull treatment they applied to stressed plating. The emergency lighting made everything the color of old photographs. Rook sat down next to him. Ken offered him the foil pack without looking at him. Rook took a mouthful of something that was definitely not stew and handed it back. They sat in silence for a moment. "You ever miss Earth?" Kane asked. Rook thought about it. "Specific things," he said. Kane waited. "My daughter's handwriting," Rook said. "She makes lowercase r look like a little wave. I can't explain it. When she was 7, she wrote me a letter, and the R in sorry looked like the Atlantic Ocean." Kane was quiet for a while. A relay somewhere in the wall ticked its once-per-second tick. "That's a weird thing to miss," Kane said. "Yeah," Rook agreed. "I miss my dog," Kane said. "He was dumb as a rock. You could throw a ball for him for 4 hours, and he would still think it was the best idea anyone had ever had." Rook nodded. He thought about a dog that never stopped believing in the ball. He thought about a daughter with an ocean in her handwriting. "The problem's crew," Kane said. "I know. They volunteered. I know. Does that make it?" "No," Rook said. "It doesn't." Kane looked at the foil pack. He took another mouthful of something that wasn't stew. "Are we going to win?" he said. Rook thought about the array, and about 15 satellite bodies instead of 17, and about the Tethani fleet recalibrating, and about the gap they'd put in the formation that could not be exploited the same way twice. "We're going to make them earn it," he said. "Either way." Kane nodded and passed the foil pack back, and Rook took another mouthful, and neither of them said anything for a while, and the relay ticked, and the emergency lighting hummed. And in the engineering bay down the corridor, Dr. Cade was running diagnostics with the focused intensity of someone rebuilding a mind from a partial blueprint. And the battle was waiting for them the way all things wait, without patience, without impatience. just with the simple inevitability of what comes next. Cade was checking node integrity on the remaining 15 satellites when she heard Vance come into the bay. She did not look up. "The array's holding," she said. 15 nodes is tight. We lose 3 more, and the predictive margin starts degrading. How many can you lose before it's useless? Cade ran the calculation that she had been running in the background of her thoughts for the last 40 minutes. 8. Below 8 it starts guessing instead of knowing. Vance sat on the edge of a supply crate. She watched Cade work for a moment. "Is it afraid?" she said. "The system." Cade's hands did not stop moving. "I don't know," she said. "I've never been able to tell." "You built it." "I built the architecture." "What it does inside that architecture?" She paused. "I watch it make decisions sometimes and I think I know why it made them. And then I look again and I realize I don't." She glanced up. "It's like asking if a river is afraid of the sea." Vance considered this. "That makes 2 of us," she said. "I've never been able to tell if I'm afraid either." Cade laughed. It was a short, surprised sound, the kind of laugh that happens when something is funny and you did not expect to find anything funny. And it was over quickly, and they both pretended it had not happened. And then they were both slightly better than they had been before, which was the point of those moments even when neither party acknowledged it. 3 more hours, Cade said. "At least," Vance agreed, and left her to the diagnostics. The Tedhani came again at the end of the 3rd hour, and this time they came differently. Thal had spent the recalibration period doing something he had never done before in 11 wars. He had taken the tactical data from the engagement and set it aside, and he had asked himself not what the doctrine said, but what the humans were actually doing. This was a discomforting exercise. The doctrine existed because it was correct. It was a codification of everything that worked, and departing from it was how engagements were lost. The Accords were not just legal structures. They were practical ones, built from 800 years of evidence about what produced successful military outcomes. The humans were ignoring them entirely, and they were still alive. He looked at the movement patterns. The Ardent was responding to firing solutions before they were transmitted. This suggested they had the ability to intercept or predict encrypted quantum communications, which was not possible with any known technology. Unless, he looked at the satellite bodies in Hesper IV's outer orbital band. They were civilian registered. Standard atmospheric monitoring and communications relay configuration. He looked at them for a long moment. Then he looked at the movement data again, and at the timing, and he felt something shift behind his 4 winter water eyes that he did not have a word for. They had built a brain, not a weapon, a thinking thing. Something that watched and predicted and told the ships where to go before the guns had decided where to aim. Something the Accords had banned because a machine making lethal decisions was considered an abomination against the principle of meaningful conscious choice in war. And the humans had built one and put it in civilian infrastructure that his fleet was not targeting because the Accords did not permit targeting civilian infrastructure. They had used the rules as armor for the thing that was destroying the rules. He sat with this for a long moment. Then he said, "Destroy the satellite bodies in the outer orbital band." His tactical officer paused. "Those are civilian registered assets, strategos. Under article. I know what they are." He thought of the document Core had brought him, the one that said we do not recognize the authority of the Accords over human citizens or human territory. He thought that perhaps he had not fully understood what that meant when he first read it. "Destroy them," he said. They destroyed 11 of the 15. The remaining 4 were either protected by debris shadow or had repositioned in the preceding hour in ways that suggested the system inside them had anticipated the possibility of this decision. In the engineering bay, Cade watched 4 nodes go dark almost simultaneously. 11, she said. The threshold was 8. She had 4 left. The margin between a brain and a guess was now the width of 4 satellite bodies in low orbit. She began rerouting. The 3rd hour of the 2nd engagement was when it fell apart. The Meridian lost attitude control in the 22nd minute of renewed fire, struck by a coordinated salvo from 3 Tedhani ships that had positioned themselves at the specific angles that minimized the predictive advantage of the 4 remaining nodes, because Thal had figured out what the nodes were doing, even if he could not replicate it, and had started reasoning about its limitations. He was doing what good commanders do when they are losing their certainty. He was shrinking the perimeter of what he needed to predict. He could not predict where the human ships would go, but he could predict where they could not go if their defensive nodes were in specific positions relative to his fleet. He was hunting the geometry of their limitation. He was a very good commander. Rook had known this going in. You did not get to 11 wars and 0 losses by being anything other than exceptional, and exceptional meant exactly this. The ability to adapt not to what the enemy was doing, but to what the enemy could do, to find the ceiling of their capability and use it against them. The 4 remaining nodes were powerful but finite. They covered certain angles and not others. Thal had begun to feel the shape of the angles they did not cover. Lieutenant Okafor felt it too, from the other side, in the way a pilot feels the degradation of a system through the quality of the ship's response. A slight hesitation in the maneuvering data, a half-second lag in the repositioning recommendations that would not have been noticeable to anyone who had not spent 8 months learning to read those recommendations like a second language. He compensated manually. He compensated with the part of him that had been trained in simulators and retrained in live engagements, and then retrained again in the specific grammar of the Meridian, which moved differently from any ship he had served on before, and which he had been learning the way you learn a person, the particular way it pulled left under sustained lateral thrust, the slight vibration in the attitude controls at high acceleration that meant it was pushing against its own design tolerances, the way. The portside display sometimes refreshed a half-second behind the others. He knew this ship. He had learned it the way you learn the only path through a forest in the dark. He did not know it enough. The coordinated salvo from 3 Tethani ships hit the Meridian in a pattern that had been calculated to exploit the half-second lag in the node data and the quarter-second of physical response time between when the recommendation arrived and when Okafor could act on it. In the space of those fractions of a second, 3 shots arrived simultaneously from different vectors, and 2 of them struck the attitude control housing, and the third struck the primary communications array, and the Meridian began, slowly, and then less slowly, to drift. Okafor fought it with 3 functional thruster pods and manual override on the weapons array for 11 minutes after attitude control was gone, which was 11 minutes longer than the Tethani tactical models had projected for a disabled ship. And he managed to get off 1 more full salvo in that time that caught a Tethani light cruiser square on its port drive housing and left it trailing incandescent gas in a slow spiral that would take it out of the engagement permanently. His crew was at their stations. He knew which ones were at their stations because he knew which ones would be, because there are ships and there are crews, and then there are the ships and crews that have been through enough together that you stop predicting what they will do because you already know, the same way you know your own hands. He had time, in the 11 minutes, to think about his sister. This was not something he chose to do. It was simply where his mind went in the spaces between actions, in the particular way that the mind goes somewhere specific when the body is doing something rote and trained and does not need the mind's full attention. He thought about the photograph folded in thirds. He thought about the last time he had seen her, at a fuel depot in the Kepler belt, 3 hours of leave between postings, the 2 of them sharing bad coffee from a vending machine that accepted 11 different currencies and produced the same gray liquid regardless. She had laughed about something he had said, and he could not remember what it was. He wanted to remember. Then the Meridian went dark. On the Ardent, Rook received this information and held it for 3 seconds. He thought. Okafor had a sister in the Kepler belt colonies. He kept a photograph of her in his left breast pocket, folded in thirds, the way people fold things they want to keep from being damaged. He had shown it to Rook once, in the break room on Meridian, with the particular casual but not casualness of someone who is proud of something and has decided to share it sideways rather than directly. She was laughing in the photograph, caught in the middle of something funny, slightly blurred, the kind of photograph that only makes sense to the person who took it. 3 seconds. He thought about the document he had signed 7 years ago, the one that said he would send people to do things he would not be doing himself because that was the nature of the position he had accepted. He had understood when he signed it that the document meant what it said, that it was not metaphorical, that eventually the arithmetic of it would be specific and real and would have names attached to it. He had understood this the way you understand things in the abstract, before they become concrete, before the names are the names of people who showed you photographs. He thought, the arithmetic has names. 3 seconds. Back to the display. The 4 remaining nodes were giving him positioning data that was half prediction and half guess now. The margin widened enough that Vance, watching the data feeds from Tactical, had started compensating manually, running her own parallel calculations, feeding corrections into the system from the human end. This was not how it was supposed to work. This was someone patching a wound with a hand because the bandages had run out. Vance had not said anything about it. She had simply started doing it, the same way she did most things, without announcement, without drama, with the efficient quietness of someone who identifies a problem and addresses it, and considers the announcement of the addressing to be a waste of time that could be used for addressing. How long? He asked Kate over the link. The nodes. A pause. A short one, the kind that means the answer is already calculated and what's happening in the pause is a decision about how to frame it. They're taking fire. Maybe 20 minutes before I'm down to 2. Below 2 it's. I know. He looked at the display. 34 functional Tethani ships, minus the one Okafor had tagged. 33. Plus the one that had taken the proximity fuse debris and was running at reduced combat effectiveness. 32 and a half, if he was being generous. 2 human ships, one of them half-blind. 78 people on those 2 ships, subtracting the ones already lost, adjusting for the ones who might be alive on the Meridian and might not be. He thought about a wave that looked like the letter R. He thought about what it had cost to get here, and what it would cost to go forward. And he thought about the specific thing he had decided in a corridor on a ship years ago, the decision that lived behind every other decision he had made since. The one where he had let a ship go because the Accord said he had to, and it had come back, and the colony it hit had been smaller than Hesper 4, and the lights below had been fewer, but they had been lights. He had stood at a viewport above that smaller colony and pressed his palm to the glass and counted the lights that were still there, and he had understood in the counting something he could not have said precisely but had been acting on ever since, that the lights were the thing. Not the ships, not the doctrine, not the record of engagements or the tactical history or the legal framework that governed when violence was permissible and how it should be conducted. The lights were the thing, and the lights were what the rules were supposed to protect. And when the rules failed the lights, it was the lights you chose. He had been choosing the lights since then. Every decision had been a version of choosing the lights. He thought about this for no longer than 3 seconds. He thought, there are still lights down there. All 400 and something of them. Kate, he said. Yes. Can the remaining nodes coordinate the problem approach for both of us simultaneously? A silence. He could hear her thinking in the quality of that silence. The particular texture of a mind working fast through a problem with known parameters and uncertain variables. You want to run it again. Modified. We don't have a third ship. We don't need one, he said. We need everything we have that isn't a ship. He started talking. She started listening. The relay in the wall ticked its once per second tick, patient as anything, keeping time for all of them.
Feel the weight of what's happening. Caddy's satellite network is down to 4 nodes, half of the threshold where it becomes useless. The problem is gone. All 12 due. The meridian is drifting. 39 names total. And Rook gave himself 3 seconds for each one before going back to the display. Now with one ship, a buckling hull, a drive running past its rated maximum, and an opponent who has mapped every limitation they have, Rook is about to attempt something that exists in no doctrine ever written. He is going to predict the future he is about to create.
On the bridge of the certainty of form, Strategos Thull watched the human ships and calculated that the engagement was essentially complete. 1 human vessel destroyed. The 2nd disabled. The 3rd, the Ardent, the command ship, the one that had been moving with such uncanny precision, was now moving with less precision. The satellite network largely eliminated, its advantage neutralized. It was still fighting. Of course it was. He had expected that. The humans had shown, consistently, that they would continue to fight past the point at which all rational modeling indicated they should have stopped. This quality had cost him 3 ships damaged and 1 effectively destroyed in an engagement against 3 opponents. This was a poor performance by any Tethani standard. He acknowledged this to himself without flinching, because the acknowledgement was necessary if he was going to complete the engagement correctly. He expected that the Ardent would fight for another 10 to 15 minutes, and then, when its damage accumulation reached the point of critical systems degradation, offer surrender. He expected to accept that surrender. He expected to take the crew aboard, treat them with full Accord-mandated humanitarian protocol, and proceed to the formal occupation of Hesper 4. He expected all of this. He was, for the 4th time this engagement, wrong. What the Ardent launched was not a weapon salvo. His tactical array classified it as an emergency debris dump, a standard maneuver for a ship shedding mass to improve thrust efficiency. 47 objects ejected from secondary ports in a spreading radial pattern, each below the velocity threshold for automatic threat classification, each carrying enough reflective signature to generate a sensor contact, but not enough mass profile to trigger a hard interception protocol. His point defense array tracked 47 contacts and classified 39 as non-threatening and flagged 8 for soft intercept, which meant low-priority tracking, which meant his weapons systems were primarily attending to other things. The 47 contacts arrived, over the course of 91 seconds, at 47 positions distributed around the perimeter of his fleet formation. Each one fired a gravity projector once. Each individual event was negligible, a brief mass distortion, 0.3 seconds, equivalent to approximately 40 kilograms of dense material appearing suddenly at a point in space. Not enough to affect a ship's systems. Not enough to damage anything. Not enough to matter. Collectively, across the formation simultaneously, they created 47 false positives in his point defense array at precisely the positions that maximized coverage confusion, and in the 6 seconds it took his tactical officer to begin the filtering process, a gap appeared in the defensive geometry of his fleet that had not existed and would not exist again. The Ardent was already through it. It had begun accelerating before the gravity projectors fired. It had begun accelerating, Thull would realize later, before the tactical officer had even noticed the debris dump, because the inference system, running on the Ardent's own processors now, had modeled the gap that the projectors would create and had started moving toward where the gap would be before the gap existed. It was predicting the future it was creating. He had no doctrine entry for this. "It's going to ram us," his tactical officer said. Thull looked at the display. The Ardent's weapons were firing, but not at the fleet in general. They were firing at specific systems on his flagship in a methodical sequence that suggested a targeting list rather than opportunistic fire, the point defense array, working through it relay by relay. The communications hub. The secondary drive housing. The things that, if they went, would leave his flagship alive and in place and completely isolated from the formation around it. Not destroyed. Not defeated. Just alone, in a ring of his own ships that could not coordinate with him and that he could not coordinate with, for however many minutes it took the backup systems to come online. It was not going to ram him. It was going to cut him off and then use the window of his isolation the way a surgeon uses a cleared field. He thought of the document. "We do not recognize the concept of a declared military engagement as distinct from any other form of violence." He had thought they were being theatrical when they wrote it. He understood now that they had been describing something real, something precise and biological, something that had nothing to do with doctrine or law or the 800 years of precedent the Accords represented. He understood that they had written it not as a political position, but as a literal description of how they were wired. For the first time in 11 wars, Strategos Valkyr Thull felt what it was like to be truly afraid. It was quieter than he would have expected. It sat in the chest like something cold and very dense, and the effect it had was not paralysis but clarity, a sudden ruthless precision about what mattered and what did not. In its light, everything that he had been thinking about for the past 4 hours shrank to its essential components. And the essential component was this. He had 32 ships, and the thing coming toward him had already decided that the difference between those numbers was less important than whatever was below on that planet, and every decision it had made in the past 4 hours had been a proof of that calculation. He looked at the display. He looked at the Ardent, the hull buckle above its engineering bay, the modified configuration of its secondary ports, the drive signature that was running hotter than its rated maximum, and had been running hotter than its rated maximum for the past hour and a half, which meant the crew had made a decision at some point to override the safety protocols on the main drive, had decided that the safety protocols protecting the ship were less important than whatever the ship needed to do, and he looked at all of this, and he thought about the document for the last time. He gave an order that violated Section 9 of his operational doctrine. "Full reverse," he said. "All ships, expand the formation perimeter." His bridge held a silence that he had never heard before in 11 wars. It lasted approximately 2 seconds, which was how long it took the beings around him to process an instruction that contradicted everything the situation seemed to call for. "Strategos," his tactical officer said, very carefully, They have one ship. Full reverse, he said again. He watched his fleet open up around the Ardent like a fist unclenching, creating space, and the Ardent passed through the space where his flagship had been, and it fired twice more at his communications hub, and one of those shots connected, and the certainty of form went to internal communications only for 47 seconds. In those 47 seconds, alone in the bubble of his own ship's silence, Thul sat with something he could not name in any language he spoke. He sat with the understanding that had been building since the first exchange and had finally arrived at a place where he could look at it directly. The Accords of War had never been tested by a species that did not believe in them. He had assumed, when he first read the human document, that their refusal was posturing, the bluster of a new species that had not yet learned the consequences of noncompliance. He had assumed that the Accords derived their authority from their practical advantages, from the fact that they produced better outcomes than unregulated warfare, and that any rational species, confronted with those advantages, would eventually conform. He had been wrong in the assumption, and the wrongness was not minor. The Accords derived their authority from the consent of species that could afford to treat war as a game. Species that had resources and redundancy and depth. Species for whom a defeated colony was a setback rather than an extinction. Species that had been shaped by enough relative stability to understand that the rules limiting violence were in everyone's long-term interest. The Accords worked because everyone playing the game shared, implicitly, the understanding that losing a battle was not the same as ending. The humans had not had that stability. The humans had spent their entire evolutionary history in the kind of environment where losing meant ending, where there was no external framework to limit how thoroughly you could be erased, where the only protection against destruction was the willingness to make the cost of your destruction higher than whatever the other party wanted. They had not arrived in the galaxy with rules because the environment that shaped them had never rewarded the development of rules. It had rewarded exactly one thing: the refusal to stop. The backup communications came online. His fleet reported that the Ardent had broadcast a message on 17 frequencies during the blackout period, addressed to all ships in the formation. He read the message. It said, "We are not fighting for this system. We are fighting for the concept that you cannot take what belongs to us. Every ship you lose here is a ship you lose for a colony of soybeans. Ask yourself what the next colony costs. Ask yourself what the one after that costs. Ask yourself where this ends." He sat with this message for a long moment. Then he made the calculation that the Accords had no language for, the calculation that lived in the space between military doctrine and the simple truth of what the past 4 hours had demonstrated. If his fleet held position and eventually destroyed the Ardent, and they would, eventually, in 20 or 30 or 50 more minutes, it would cost more ships and more time. And the destruction of the Ardent would not end the question the Ardent had spent 4 hours asking. The question would survive. The humans would have an answer to it, would know the precise shape of what it cost to defend one system against his fleet, would begin from that specific knowledge rather than from ignorance. And he would have to do this again. And the next time, they would know more. He looked at the agricultural colony below. He thought about protein compounds in boardrooms and the formal declaration filed through proper channels. He thought about a species that had read the Accords and written a document in response that said, "We do not recognize your authority," and then had spent 4 hours proving they meant it with 3 ships against 37. He thought about 12 people on a cargo hauler. He made the calculation. He gave the order to withdraw. The Ardent did not win by destroying 32 ships. No one who tells this story should ever say that. It matters how it happened. They won by doing the thing that Thul's recalibration could not account for, because it was not a tactic and it was not in any document, and it was not something you could model with the tools that had built the Accords of War across 800 years of civilized conflict. They won by doing it again. Whatever they had done to still be fighting. The spare parts stripped from dead systems. The nodes rerouted past their safe operating range. The crew working with the specific wordless efficiency of people who had stopped thinking about whether and were only thinking about how. They did it again, and then again after that. Past every threshold that the models said was survivable. Past every point that any rational actor would have identified as the moment to stop. Kane was in a damage control corridor when the hull breach happened. A secondary hit that opened a 60-centimeter split in the outer plating 2 compartments from his position, and he heard the sound of atmosphere rushing toward where it was not supposed to be. not a dramatic sound, not the roar of decompression from the films, just a specific hiss that a person who knew ships could distinguish from the sound of recycled air. A hiss that had direction and urgency to it. A hiss that meant something was leaving that should be staying. He felt the pressure change in his ears, a small pop followed by a lightness in his sinuses, and he was already moving before he had decided to move, pulling emergency sealing foam from the wall locker and going toward the sound rather than away from it, because that was the thing they did. That was the thing they had always done, the thing that no one had ever successfully explained to anyone who had not done it themselves. The part of a human being that moves toward the breach. He did not think about whether it was sensible. He had not thought about whether it was sensible the first time he had done it, 7 years ago on a different ship in a different emergency, and he had not thought about it the 40-some times since. There was a breach. He went toward it. Yi, in the aft gun bay, had been firing the kinetic driver on manual override for 40 minutes when it jammed, and she cleared the jam with a technique she had learned from a maintenance manual she'd read 4 years ago in a training facility on Earth, a manual written for a different weapons system that shared enough mechanical principles with this one that the technique transferred, barely, if you applied it with enough force and the right angle. And when it cleared, she went back to feeding ammunition cassettes, and her shoulder, which had been hurting since the second hour, had reached the point where it was just part of the landscape. She had stopped humming somewhere in the third hour. She was not aware she had stopped. She was running on the narrow channel of full concentration that experienced soldiers call the tunnel, and civilians sometimes call focus, and which is actually neither of those things. It is what happens when everything in a human being that is not immediately relevant to continued survival quietly folds itself away to make room for the part that is. She fed the cassette. She fired. She fed the next one. Cade watched the last 2 nodes go dark in the 5th hour and switched to the backup inference engine, the safety net under the safety net. And something happened that she had not expected, which was that the engine adapted. She had built it to replicate what the network did, to serve as a replacement for the distributed processing the satellites had provided. Instead, it did something slightly different. It made different predictions than the network had made. Not wrong predictions, different ones. Predictions that accounted for variables the network had been too large and distributed to weight properly. She watched the Ardent's movement data adjust in response to these different predictions, and she thought, it has been watching this engagement for hours. It has been learning. The engine was not replacing the network. The engine was doing something the network had not known to do. She almost said something to Rook about this. She decided to say it after, when there was an after. The Ardent kept moving. Thull's withdrawal was orderly and managed, and in keeping with every visual protocol of a tactical repositioning rather than a retreat. His fleet moved toward the Yeldrin transit point in perfect formation, maintaining weapons readiness, maintaining calm discipline, maintaining the appearance of a fleet making a strategic choice rather than a fleet that had spent 5 hours being reshaped by something it did not have a framework for understanding. Rook watched it go and did not pursue. He stood at the tactical display for a long time after the last Tethani ship transited out of the system, and the display showed him empty space and the curve of the planet below and the faint sensor ghosts of debris in the engagement zone, and he stood there until the display had nothing more to tell him. Then he went to the viewport, and he pressed his palm flat against the glass, and he looked at Hesper 4 below. 400 and something lights. All still there. He counted them. He got to 400 and something and lost count. He started over. He gave the order to withdraw. The withdrawal was managed, orderly, completely in keeping with Tethani doctrine for a tactical repositioning. It did not look like a retreat. It was not called a retreat. It was not recorded as a retreat in any official log. But it moved his fleet away from Hesper 4 and toward the Yeldrin transit point, and as it did, the Ardent, which had been preparing what its crew had been calling in their heads the thing after the last thing, held position and did not pursue, and watched them go. The space where the Tethani fleet had been was just space again. The Ardent hung in it with the particular exhausted stillness of a thing that had been in motion for so long that stillness felt foreign in its components. Somewhere in the ship, metal was still ticking as it cooled from temperature gradients that had not fully normalized. The hull plating above the engineering bay still had the buckle in it, a gentle inward curve that caught the light from Hesper IV's sun differently from the surrounding panels. The emergency amber lighting had been replaced by regular lighting in most of the ship, but not all of it, and the zones where it had not been replaced glowed orange in a way that felt almost warm. The smell of the ship was the smell of a ship that had been through what this ship had been through. Burned polymer, machine oil, and metal. The faint organic smell of too many people in too small a space under too much stress for too many hours. Underneath all of it, barely there, the clean, cold smell of the vacuum through the sealed hull breach. They counted first. Rook stood in the main corridor outside the bridge, and he counted, and Vance counted beside him, and Kane counted from the damage control station, and what they counted was not ships or tactical advantages or firing solutions. They counted names. The problem's crew. 12. He named all 12. In the order he had their files memorized, which was not alphabetical but the order in which he had met them. Each name took the time it took. There was no rushing it. The people around him were very still. Lieutenant Okafor and the Meridian crew. 41. The Meridian had been found on the long-range sensors, drifting but intact, atmospheric pressure holding, which meant there were survivors. How many survivors was not yet known, which was its own particular weight, because it meant that Okafor was either among the survivors or not, and no one could say yet. Rook held this uncertainty the way you hold something very hot that you cannot put down. He thought about the photograph folded in thirds. He thought about a sister in the Kepler Belt colonies. The Meridian had been found drifting with atmospheric pressure intact and 14 survivors, which meant 27 who were not. Okafor was among the survivors. He was in the ship's medical bay with a concussion and a broken collarbone and something that the medic described as a functional dissociative response, which was the clinical name for the thing that happens when a person's mind refuses to fully inhabit the present moment because the present moment contains more than it can currently hold. Okafor would be okay. The medic had been careful to say this in a way that conveyed what it meant. Okay was a long road from here, and the road would not be straight, but it was a road that could be walked. Rook had received this information and held it the way he held all information in this register, briefly, completely, and then he had set it aside in the place where it would stay until there was time for it, and he had gone back to what needed to be done. He named the 27 now. He did not use rank. He used names. He said each one in the order they appeared in his memory, which was not alphabetical and not chronological, but the order in which each face had become specific to him. The moment when each person had stopped being a crew member and started being a person he knew, which was different, which was a thing that happened in small increments over time that you only noticed in retrospect, usually at a moment like this one. The crew of the problem came after. 12 names. He knew each of them less well than the Meridian dead, because the problem had been assembled in the last 3 months from volunteers who had heard about what was happening at Hesper 4 and made a decision that Rook had accepted and that he would think about for a long time. He said each of their names. He held each one. 39 names total. He said them in a corridor on a damaged ship above a planet that was still alive. He did not say anything after. He did not say they died for something. He did not say it was worth it. He did not say anything that would put a frame around the names that made them easier to carry. The names were what they were, which was the specific weight of specific people, and they would be that weight for as long as anyone who had known them was alive to feel it. He did not say these things out loud. He carried them. Kane had his hands flat on a console and his head down, and Rook could see the particular stillness of someone who was working very hard at something internal. Yi was standing by the far wall with her arms crossed, which was how she stood when she was doing the same thing. Kate had come up from the engineering bay and stood with them in the corridor without having been asked to. The grief and the victory existed in the same space, and there was no resolving them, and no one tried. They were in orbit around Hesper 4 for 4 hours before anyone went down to the surface. The first shuttle to descend carried Kane and 2 of his damage control crew and a crate of medical supplies from the ship's stores, because the colony had a clinic and the clinic needed restocking after 4 hours of emergency protocols that had never actually been triggered because the battle had stayed in orbit and never reached the ground. Kane walked through the colony's central square in the early morning light of Hesper IV's primary star, which was yellower than Earth's sun and slightly colder, and the air smelled like agriculture. The specific green-in soil smell of a working farm that has been under stress, the way plants smell when the weather has been wrong for a few days, something tense in the biological systems that you can smell if you know what you're looking for. The colony had not been touched by the battle. This was the strange part that Kane noticed and could not stop noticing. Everything here was intact. The central square had its fountain running, the water cycling through a pump that had clearly not been stopped by the emergency protocols, because whoever had designed the emergency protocols had included the fountain as something worth keeping on, or had simply not thought to turn it off, or had turned it on again after the all clear, and then stood here for a moment the way people stand in front of water when they are trying to remember that the world is still working. The market stalls at the square's edge had their shutters down, but they were down in the careful way of a business that intends to open tomorrow rather than in the haphazard way of a business that has been evacuated in a hurry. 11,000 people had spent 4 hours in shelter protocols, listening to a battle that was close enough to be visible on handheld sensors as moving lights in the orbital band, and had come back out to the square when the lights stopped moving, and the fountain was still running, and the morning was coming up over the eastern ridge in the way mornings do on a world that has not been destroyed. There was a girl sitting on the edge of the central square's fountain. She was maybe 8 years old. She had something in her lap that she was drawing on, a sketchbook, old-fashioned, paper. She was drawing something with a stylus. Kane stopped and looked at her drawing, which was of a ship. The ship had guns. The guns were very large. The ship itself was shaped more like a dog than a starship, because she was 8 and the artistic conventions of military spacecraft had not yet become part of her visual vocabulary. "Is that a real ship?" he said. She looked at him, and then at the ship drawing, and then back at him. "It's the one that saved us," she said. He looked at the drawing for a moment. The ship had 4 of the very large guns and a face, 2 eyes, a mouth that was slightly open. "It does look like that, actually," he said. She went back to drawing. He went back to carrying the medical supplies. Above, the Ardent turned slowly in the yellow light. On the surface of a different world, 800 light-years from Hesper 4, Strategos Velkirin Thul sat in his private quarters on the home world with his 4 winter-water eyes open in the dark. He had filed his report. The engagement had been recorded as an inconclusive tactical withdrawal pending strategic reassessment. This was the language the doctrine used, and it was not inaccurate, exactly, but it was not complete. And Thul was the kind of being who had always found it important to know the complete version of things, even when the complete version was uncomfortable. The complete version was this. He had taken 37 ships to a system defended by 3 ships, one of which was a converted cargo hauler, and he had withdrawn. He had done this because the 3 ships and the things the 3 ships were doing had made him recalculate, and in the recalculation the cost of staying had exceeded the value of the colony, and so he had left. This was rational. This was correct. He would do it again. But there was something underneath the rational that he could not file in the report and could not make into doctrine and could not explain to his officers or the Ascending Council in language they would accept as serious. He had been afraid of one ship. He had been afraid of it the way you are afraid of something when you realize that you do not know the rules of the thing you are facing. He had fought 11 wars under the Accords, and the Accords created a shared reality. Both sides knew the parameters. Both sides operated inside the same set of possible moves. Both sides could model each other because they were each other's mirror in the way that any 2 players of the same game are mirrors. And in that shared reality, he had been undefeated. The humans had refused the shared reality. They had looked at 800 years of galactic military history and said, in a document filed through diplomatic channels, that they did not recognize its authority. And then they had backed it up. Not with superior technology or superior numbers, with the willingness to make the shared reality irrelevant by stepping entirely outside of it. What he had faced was not tactics. What he had faced was a species that had decided, at some level below strategy, below politics, below doctrine, that there were no rules when someone attacked your home. That the rules were a game, and the game was what you played when you had the luxury of choosing your moves. And the humans had looked at the Tethani fleet above their colony and felt something he had no word for that made the game invisible. He sat in the dark. He thought about 12 people on a cargo hauler. He thought about what it would cost to go back. Not in ships. Not in time. In the specific thing that the Ardent had cost him that he had no word for. The certainty. The mirror. The shared reality in which he had always been undefeated. He thought, if he went back, the humans would be there. And they would have learned from this engagement. And they would have built more satellites and modified more cargo haulers and found more of the things that were in the gap between the Accords and the territory the Accords did not cover, and they would be further outside the shared reality than they had been before, and he would be trying to defeat something that was Each time he tried, more itself. He sat in the dark for a very long time. He did not write anything down. He turned one thought over and over in the way you turn something over when you are trying to see all its sides. When you know the shape of it is important, and you do not want to finish looking until you have seen everything. The Accords were not protecting peace. He had believed they were, for 416 years of galactic conflict, for 800 years of recorded history, for the 11 wars he had fought in them and won. He had believed they were a structure for limiting destruction and preserving species and maintaining something he would have called, in quieter moments, civilization. What he understood now, sitting in the dark on a world that the humans had never heard of, was that the Accords were protecting certainty. They were protecting the ability of every species who had signed them to model every other species who had signed them. They were protecting the mirror. They were protecting the shared game in which no one had to be afraid of what they could not predict, because everything was within the rules, and the rules created the boundaries of the possible. And the humans had not signed them. And the humans had not signed them not because they were new and did not know better, as he had thought when he read the document the first time, but because some part of them, some part that was older than doctrine, older than civilization, older than the concept of a rule, understood that you do not sign documents that limit how you protect the people you love. He put his hand flat against the cold wall of his quarters, and he sat with this, and he did not move for a long time. 800 light years away, Rook's hand was doing the same thing, pressed against the cold viewport of the Ardent, palm flat, looking at open space where the fleet had been. He was counting again, not colony lights this time. Stars. He got to 400 and something and lost count and started over, and the stars did not move, and the space around them was very quiet, and below the ship the colony lights of Hesper 4 were still all there, 400 and something, every one of them, burning away in the dark of a world that was still alive. The stories that will be told about Hesper 4 are going to be about the tactics. They are going to be about the gravity drone swarm and the satellite array and the repurposed cargo hauler, and those stories will be accurate as far as they go. Military historians will write papers about the asymmetric doctrine. Academy instructors will build case studies. The phrase Hesper doctrine will enter usage within a decade, a shorthand for the idea that any technology or infrastructure can be a weapon if the people holding it have decided to use it that way, and that the most dangerous weapon is not the one that causes the most destruction but the one you do not expect, in the hands of someone who has decided they have nothing to lose by being creative. But those stories will miss the thing that was underneath the tactics. The thing underneath was this: a species that had not yet learned to put the rules above the reason for the rules. A species that had arrived in a galaxy where the agreed-upon game of war had been running for so long that everyone playing it had forgotten it was a game, had mistaken the rules for reality, had begun to treat the possibility of being destroyed as less horrifying than the social cost of refusing the rules. And then something happened to a colony, and 12 people got on a cargo hauler, and a man who kept a photograph in his breast pocket fired one more salvo with 3 functional thruster pods. And a woman in an engineering bay built a safety net under the safety net under the safety net, because that was who she was, because some part of her had always understood that the last line of defense is the thing you haven't used yet. And a sergeant sat in a corridor eating something that was not stew and thought about a dog who never stopped believing in the ball, and a corporal hummed without knowing she was humming, and a private wrote letters he never sent while keeping his stylus in the pocket where it would survive the loss of everything else, and an admiral pressed his palm against cold glass and counted lights, and the lights were all still there. The galaxy will call it a military engagement. The history books will call it a turning point. The beings who were there will not call it anything for a long time, because the words for it have not quite been found yet. What it was, at the level beneath all of those words, was a thing humans have been doing since before they had ships or satellites or names for the stars they were looking at, refusing. The flat, absolute, biologically fundamental refusal to accept that the mathematics of the situation is the last word on the situation. The refusal to let the rules of the game take the place of the reason you were playing. The refusal, and this is the part that no species with a pure rational architecture has ever been able to model correctly, because it does not come from reason. It comes from something older and stranger and more stubborn than reason. To look at the people around you, at the lights below you, at the handwriting of someone you love, at the photograph folded in thirds, at the dog who always believed in the ball, and decide that those things are worth more than the rules, and worth more than the math, and worth more than the calm and certain and perfectly organized conclusion being drawn by an opponent with 32 ships and 800 years of unbroken precedent. And to press your hand flat against the cold glass and look out at the thing coming toward you and choose, in the space between one breath and the next, without ceremony, without a speech, without anything except the simple, terrible human insistence on being here, to stay.
Thul didn't withdraw because he was outgunned. He withdrew because he met something his 800 years of precedent had no category for. A species that refused to let the rules of the engagement become more important than the reason for it. The accords worked because every species playing had enough stability to treat defeat as a setback, not an ending. The humans never had the luxury, so when 37 warships appeared above their colony, they looked at 800 years of civilized military conduct and said, "Lovely game. We are not playing it." 39 people didn't come home. 400 and something lights are still burning. The historians will call it doctrine. What it actually was is the oldest human refusal there is, the refusal to let the math be the last word.